Okay, this video is just going to go over the different forms of market failures that we've talked about in class, just as a review for anybody who wants to see them in more detail. Okay, so as always, we start with our supply and demand curve. Remember that the demand curve shows us private willingness to pay, and the supply curve shows us private marginal costs. So we'll start out with showing a negative externality. So remember, negative externality is a situation where there is some sort of external cost that's borne by a third party, not someone who's involved in the trade. And so someone, an innocent bystander, a party who doesn't get to say whether or not the trade occurs. So the classic example of this is pollution. You and I purchase cars from GM and Ford and all sorts of different manufacturers, and we purchase them based on the price to us and the cost to the manufacturer. So we don't think about the fact that when we drive, we are creating pollution that may make greenhouse gases higher and might have some effects on climate change. We don't think about that. And so there's this external cost to people who aren't involved in that decision. And so the way we represent that is that we take that third party external cost, right, and we add it to the private marginal costs. And so I'm just going to add it here. And we're assuming in this example that the external cost is constant per unit that is purchased. So what it does is it just shifts up the private marginal cost. And so what we have is a social or total marginal cost curve. And we will maximize efficiency by producing where the total marginal cost is equal to the total willingness to pay. And in this example, we don't have any external benefits from purchasing, so private willingness to pay is equal to total willingness to pay. And so we can contrast that to the market quantity and the market price. And what we have is that the price is too low and the quantity is too high, and so as a result we get some deadweight loss. And the deadweight loss are going to be those units that are consumed, so the difference between QE and Q star, those units that are consumed where the total cost of producing and consuming those units exceeds the total benefit or the willingness to pay. So here's our deadweight loss. And it's because we're producing too much relative to the efficient quantity. And the price is, in effect, too low. All right, so that's the negative externality. We can correct the negative externality by taxing it. If we set a tax equal to the external cost. Remember how we show taxes? When we show taxes is what we have as an effective supply curve that is equal to the regular supply curve plus the amount of the tax. So if the tax is equal to the external cost, then what we have is an effective supply curve that just runs along the same curve as the total marginal cost. And the effective supply curve tells us how much will be provided given the price that the consumer pays, and we look for the intersection of the demand curve and the effective supply curve, and we get the quantity under the tax level is the same as the effective quantity. The price to the buyer is the same as the equilibrium price, and then the price to the seller, of course, is lower. And what we then have is the quantity under the tax equal to the efficient quantity, and the deadweight loss goes away. And so what we have is by taxing, we have basically internalized the external cost. So this is true if the tax is equal to the external cost. I've shown the easy way, and the easy way is where the tax and the external cost are both constant per unit produced. You could have a tax and an external cost that varies depending on the quantity that is being consumed. So you could have pollution that is low at low levels of consumption and higher at other levels of consumption. In that case, what you're going to have is a situation where you're going to have, instead of these sort of parallel shifts, right? So here's our demand, here's our marginal private cost, and here's our marginal social cost, right? So you can see that they start out closer and then they get further away. But everything else is the same approach to fixing it. You basically set the tax equal to the external cost at the equilibrium quantity, and you'll get the same result. Okay, let me just pause it for a second. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is do a positive externality. Okay, so positive externality, start with the same demand equals private willingness to pay, supply equals private marginal cost, right? The market equilibrium, price and quantity. If we have a positive externality, then there's some sort of external benefit to consumption that's not captured by the willingness to pay for the consumer. And so what we do is we add that external benefit to the private benefit, and we get the social willingness to pay. To maximize surplus, we want to have all those units where the social willingness to pay exceeds the, we want to have all those units where the social willingness to pay exceeds the marginal private cost consumed. And so if we were just consuming at Q star, we'd have these units here where total benefit, social benefit exceeds cost, and so we are not consuming enough, and so this is deadweight loss. And it's deadweight loss because essentially we're consuming too little. We're not capturing these possible benefits that we could be getting. And so the way to solve this is to have a subsidy, right? And if we set a subsidy equal to this external benefit, remember when we set a subsidy, it's like a negative tax. So we bring down the supply curve by the amount of the subsidy, and we get the effective supply curve, which tells us the supply that would be produced for a specific price to the buyer. And we look for where the effective supply curve intersects the demand curve. It intersects here. This is the price to the buyer. Of course, the price to the seller is higher. That's what happens with a subsidy, and you can see that we get out to the efficient quantity, and we get there by having a lower price, the price equal to the, so we get there by having a price equal to this efficient price. So that increases demand, and of course the suppliers get the higher price from the subsidy, so we get a subsidy quantity equal to this efficient quantity. Okay, so that's it for positive externalities. Let's move on now to imperfect information. So imperfect information is pretty straightforward. What we have is a demand curve that's based on perceived value or willingness to pay. And then we've got a supply curve that's based on marginal private cost. And it could be the case that there's information out there that the consumers don't have that would actually increase their value, right? And so the true value would be higher than the perceived value. In that case, what we have is deadweight loss, because there are these units here where true value exceeds the cost, but they're not being consumed because the market equilibrium and price are lower. And if only that information could be revealed, then we would have a shift out in demand, and we would actually achieve those that surplus. We could also have a situation where the true value is lower than the perceived value because there's, the product is going to cause damages or something like that. And so in that case, our deadweight loss is because we have people consuming units where the cost of production exceeds their true value. We have too many units being produced, and there's the deadweight loss associated with that. So pretty straightforward. You can solve these kinds of these kinds of market imperfections by providing that information. So let's move along. Okay, now we also have market failures that are based on problems in the supply, or not problems, but things in supply that violate the assumptions of perfect competition. So you can have a monopoly. So here we have a demand that looks just like a normal demand. Here's our marginal cost curve. But remember that in monopoly, because the individual individual seller, the single seller, controls the price, instead of focusing on demand, we think about marginal revenue. And this buyer is going to be focusing on only selling where the marginal revenue, the increased revenue from selling that additional unit, is equal to marginal cost. So we have a quantity that's produced under the monopoly and a price that's set by taking that quantity and then going up to the demand curve. And we have a deadweight loss because we have units that are not being consumed, where demand for those units exceeds the cost of providing those units. And so that's the deadweight loss associated with monopoly. We can also have a natural monopoly. And for a natural monopoly, we have a demand curve. We have a marginal cost curve that is often very low, and a significant fixed cost that gives us high average total costs that then asymptote at the marginal cost curve. And the problem is, of course, that this is a monopoly, and so we have a marginal revenue curve. This is where the monopolist would want to sell, and we have the deadweight loss associated with that. There's no solution by increasing the number of firms in the market, though, because of this declining average total cost curve. And so if we have two firms in the market, then they are both going to be producing on a high point of the average total cost curve, and that will also be inefficient. We want to just have the one firm in this market who's paying those high fixed costs, and then be able to maximize the amount of quantity that they produce. So often we regulate natural monopolies, and we force the natural monopolies to produce where they break even, right? And so we can regulate and have a regulated price and a regulated quantity. There's still a little bit of deadweight loss here because we're not producing this tiny bit where willingness to pay exceeds marginal cost. But that's okay, because if we wanted to get that, we would have to subsidize the market, and we might not feel that we wanted to do that. Okay, so there's some real basics on market failures. We're talking about them in class. They're in your textbook, and we'll talk about solutions to them as well. But I just wanted to go over those and to show you where the deadweight loss was, in case you guys wanted to look at it in sort of a slower format, or be able to pause and look at all the different parts. Thanks a lot. Bye.